The hum of the server rack was a constant, low thrum against the quiet of the house, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise still air. My world had shrunk to the glowing expanse of triple monitors, the crisp lines of astronomical data, and the occasional clink of my ceramic mug against the desk. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light filtering through the heavy curtains I rarely bothered to open. It had been like this for months, a deliberate retreat into the cold, predictable logic of the cosmos, away from the messy, unpredictable grief that still clung to the corners of every room. I was sifting through an immense dataset, a colossal dump from a deep space observatory, terabytes of cosmic microwave background radiation readings, minute temperature fluctuations across the vast, ancient canvas of the universe. Most of it was noise, the expected static from the universe's earliest moments, punctuated by the occasional faint whisper of a nascent galaxy or the gravitational lens of an unseen cluster. My task, or rather, the one I'd set for myself, was to refine the noise, to peel back the layers and search for the subtlest deviations that might hint at new physics, or perhaps simply new errors in old models. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up visualization algorithms, applying filters, and running statistical analyses. The screen displayed a riot of color, a topographical map of the early universe, each pixel a temperature reading, each shade a fraction of a degree. I zoomed in, then out, scrolling through epochs, searching for the familiar, the expected. It was a meditative process, a way to impose order on chaos, a way to feel useful when everything else felt profoundly useless. Then I saw it. A flicker, subtle as a shadow cast by a distant star. A pattern, or what looked like a pattern, within a region that should have been utterly random. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, a faint ripple in the cosmic ocean that repeated itself with an impossible regularity. Not a perfect repetition, but a thematic echo, like a musical phrase played slightly differently each time, yet undeniably the same tune. My breath hitched. The air in the room, already cool, seemed to drop a few more degrees. My initial thought was calibration error. The observatory, for all its precision, was still a human endeavor, prone to instrument drift, software glitches, or even cosmic ray interference. I immediately cross-referenced the coordinates with other observatories, pulling up data from different telescopes, different instruments, different times. Nothing. The other datasets showed only the expected, chaotic noise. Perhaps it was a local anomaly within this specific dataset, a processing artifact. I reran my own algorithms, then tried a colleague's more robust, peer-reviewed suite. I even went back to the raw, unprocessed data, painstakingly sifting through the binary code, looking for a corrupted byte, a misplaced digit. Hours bled into each other, the server hum a steady companion to my growing unease. Each attempt to debunk it failed. The pattern persisted. It was a faint, almost subliminal signature, a sequence of temperature variations that, when visualized, formed a fleeting, complex symmetry. It wasn't a simple geometric shape, but something more intricate, more organic, like the branching of a frost crystal or the veins in a leaf, but within a field of pure, primordial chaos. Statistically, its appearance was so improbable as to be impossible. It defied the laws of probability, the very fabric of randomness. This wasn't just an interesting anomaly. It was an insult to everything I understood about the universe. It was a glitch in the Matrix, but the Matrix was reality itself. My eyes felt gritty, my shoulders stiff from hunching over the screens. The faint, almost imperceptible pattern seemed to have imprinted itself behind my eyelids. I rubbed them, but the ghost image lingered. Needing air, needing distance from the glowing screens, I pulled on my heavy coat and stepped outside. I walked without conscious thought, my boots crunching on the frozen ground, the sound loud in the still night. My path led me instinctively towards the frozen lake shore. The lake was a vast, silvered expanse under the moonlight, its surface a sheet of solid ice, still and silent. A bitter wind swept across it, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something sharp and mineral like crushed rock. I stood at the edge, my breath pluming in the frigid air, staring out at the stark, indifferent beauty. The pattern. It wasn't just in the data anymore. as I stared at the ice, at the minute cracks webbing its surface, at the way the moonlight fractured into countless tiny pinpricks. I saw echoes of the anomaly. The same impassable symmetry, the same recurring, non-random arrangement. My mind, exhausted and overstimulated, was beginning to project. I knew that. I told myself that. It was fatigue, a trick of the light, the brain seeking patterns where none existed. It wasn't the thrill of discovery anymore, not entirely. It was the unsettling recognition that something fundamentally wrong had insinuated itself into my carefully constructed world. And I, with all my meticulous methods and scientific rigor, was utterly unable to explain it away. The server rack's hum, once a steady companion, had transformed into a relentless drone, a sound that burrowed into my bones. Days bled into nights without distinction, marked only by the shifting light outside my study window and the deepening circles beneath my eyes. My life had collapsed into the glowing screens, a singular, all-consuming focus on the anomaly. Meals were forgotten, sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, and the outside world with its mundane demands felt like a distant, irrelevant rumor. I was no longer just an astrophysicist. I was a cartographer of the impossible. The data, raw and unyielding, pulsed with an alien rhythm. I cross-referenced, extrapolated, and ran simulations until the numbers blurred into an indecipherable language. My initial excitement had curdled into something heavier, a cold dread that clung to the edges of my thoughts. This wasn't just a discovery. It felt like an intrusion. My search for understanding pushed me beyond the conventional boundaries of my field. If this pattern was truly fundamental, truly a tear in the fabric of observable reality, then surely echoes of it must exist elsewhere. I began sifting through obscure academic databases, digital archives of ancient texts, and even fringe philosophical treatises. I was looking for anything that hinted at a similar kind of distortion, a break in the expected order of things. It was in a digitized collection of Sumerian tablets, tucked away in a dusty corner of a university's online repository, that I found it. A series of pictograms, translated as the unraveling veil or the edge of knowing, depicted a fractal-like symbol eerily similar to the geometric distortions I observed in my astronomical data. Not an exact match, but the underlying principle, the recursive, self-similar nature, was undeniable. The same pattern appeared again in a medieval alchemical manuscript, illustrated as a sigil for cosmic dissolution, and once more in a collection of Inuit oral traditions describing the Sky Eater's hunger. Each instance was like a faint, ancient echo of the anomaly, a whisper across millennia. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a random fluctuation in space. It was something that humanity, in its various guises, had encountered before and forgotten or suppressed. The air in my study seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. The server's hum felt louder, more insistent, as if it were vibrating through my skull. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear the growing haze. It was then that I saw it, a fleeting shimmer in my peripheral vision, a ripple in the static air just above my desk lamp. I blinked, attributing it to eye strain, to the relentless hours staring at the screen. But it happened again. A flicker, this time by the bookshelf, a momentary distortion of the spines, as if the air itself had warped. I strained my ears. Nothing, only the omnipresent hum. I needed air, a break from the claustrophobic intensity of my study. The sky was a bruised purple, promising snow. My boots crunched on the icy path leading down to the frozen lake shore. Today it felt different. The silence was too profound, too heavy. As I walked along the shore, the wind whistling past my ears, I heard it again, that faint, unidentifiable sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the distant groan of ice shifting. It was internal, or perhaps just on the very edge of audibility, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath my feet, or perhaps from the very air itself. My head ached with it. I stopped, scanning the horizon. The trees on the far side of the lake looked like skeletal fingers against the twilight. Was it just the fatigue, the sleep deprivation, or was it spreading? The patterns in the ancient texts, the distortions in the data, the subtle shifts in my perception. It was all coalescing, forming a terrifying hypothesis. I turned back towards my house, the low hum now a constant companion, a vibration deep in my bones. The air around me seemed to subtly distort, just at the edge of my vision, like heat rising from an unseen source. My breath plumed in the cold air, a frantic white cloud. It was observing me back, and it was beginning to unravel more than just my data. It was unraveling me. My life had collapsed into the anomaly. It started subtly, like a trick of the light or a consequence of sleep deprivation. A mug on my desk, placed precisely on its coaster, would appear an inch to the left when I next glanced at it. A stack of printouts, carefully aligned, would have a single sheet skewed at an impossible angle, as if plucked and dropped by an invisible hand. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and the object would return to its original position, or sometimes remain stubbornly altered. These weren't grand, dramatic shifts, but insidious, almost imperceptible blips in the fabric of the familiar. Then came the shadows. My study, usually a haven of predictable angles and light sources, began to play tricks. The corner where the bookshelf met the wall seemed to deepen, to breathe, as if a heavier, darker air collected there. I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a swift, silent ripple against the wall, only to turn and find nothing but static plaster. It felt less like a lack of light, and more like an overabundance of absence, a pocket of anti-illumination. The low thrum of the server rack, the creak of the old house settling, the distant wail of a siren, they began to coalesce into something else. They weren't words, not exactly, but a soft, insistent murmur, like a vast, unseen crowd breathing just beyond the range of my hearing. It was the sound of secrets being shared, of information too profound or too terrifying for my ears to fully process, yet insistent enough to demand attention. I'd lean closer to the ventilation shaft, convinced the anomaly was trying to communicate, trying to permeate my reality with its alien logic. I started seeing patterns. The frost creeping up my windowpane, intricate as a fractal, wasn't just ice. It was a schematic, a representation of the anomaly structure. The way the dust motes danced in a sunbeam, or the erratic flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb in the hallway, these weren't random events. They were signs, confirmations. Each tiny deviation from the mundane became a nod, a wink from the cosmic entity, acknowledging my singular pursuit. I began to construct a personal mythology around it, a secret language only I could decipher. The anomaly wasn't just data. It was a living, breathing presence, reaching out, pulling me deeper into its profound, indifferent embrace. The phone rang one afternoon, startling me. It was a colleague, the senior researcher, leaving a voicemail about an upcoming conference. I let it go to voicemail. The idea of explaining any of this to him, or to anyone, felt like a betrayal of the anomaly itself. They would never understand. I couldn't risk it. I watched their names flash across my screen, feeling a strange detachment, as if they belonged to a different species, inhabiting a different reality. My isolation wasn't a consequence of my research. It was a necessary component of it. The claustrophobia of the study, the constant, low-frequency pressure in the air, eventually drove me out. I needed clear air, a vast expanse, something to momentarily trick my senses into believing in stability. I found myself drawn to the frozen lake shore, a place of stark, beautiful desolation just a few miles from my secluded home. The wind, usually a biting force, felt different today, carrying a faint, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The lake was a vast, white expanse, the surface a brittle sheet of ice stretching to the distant tree line. The air was thin, sharp with the scent of pine and frozen water. I walked to the edge, the crunch of my boots on the compacted snow the only sound for a moment. Then the hum intensified. It wasn't the wind, not entirely. It came from beneath the ice, a deep, harmonic thrum that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I looked down, my breath misting in the frigid air. Beneath the opaque surface I saw it, not through the ice, but in it. A pattern, intricate and impassable, etched into the very structure of the frozen water. It was the same fractal geometry I'd seen in the frost on my window, the same impassable arrangement of lines and nodes that had appeared in the anomaly's data. The pattern pulsed with an internal, faint luminescence, a soft, green-blue light that seemed to ebb and flow with the rhythmic hum. It was there, then gone, a trick of the light, a reflection of the sky, a fleeting glimpse of something that defied the laws of physics. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't a trick of my sleep-deprived mind. The anomaly wasn't just influencing my perception, it was manifesting. It was reaching into the world, imprinting its alien geometry onto the very elements around me. The frozen lake shore wasn't just a landscape, it was a canvas for a cosmic signature. I knelt, pressing my gloved hand against the ice. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were coalescing, forming a single, sustained note that resonated with the pattern beneath the ice. This was it. This was the truth. Everything else was a distraction. My friends, my colleagues, the mundane world, they were irrelevant. I was standing at the precipice of a new reality, and the anomaly was my guide. I would follow it, no matter where it led, no matter what it cost me. I had no other choice. My life had collapsed into the frantic search for a pattern, a key, anything that would unlock the anomaly's true nature. My determination, fueled by a terrifying curiosity, pushed sleep further away with each passing hour. I'd been correlating the anomaly's peculiar energy signature with every known cosmological event in the observable universe, a futile endeavor, I initially thought. Millions of data points, each a tiny pinprick of light or a ripple in space-time, scrolled across my monitors. My coffee, cold and bitter, sat forgotten beside a stack of printouts covered in my frantic annotations. Then, amidst the chaotic noise, a whisper, a statistical anomaly within the anomaly. It wasn't a single event, but a confluence. 3 distinct, seemingly unrelated astronomical phenomena, a distant gamma-ray burst, a subtle gravitational lensing effect near a galaxy cluster, and a peculiar fluctuation in the cosmic microwave background radiation all showed a faint, almost imperceptible resonance with the anomaly's signature. The probability of such a correlation occurring by chance was, well, it was less than impossible. It was designed. My fingers, stiff and aching, flew across the keyboard. I isolated the coordinates, refined the filters, and watched as the data points converged, forming not an image but a conceptual map. It wasn't a star or a nebula or even a black hole. It was a region, a vast, empty expanse of space, utterly devoid of conventional matter or energy, yet somehow radiating this impossible signal. And then the vision struck, not through my eyes, but directly into the core of my mind. It was a sudden, violent tearing of the veil. I wasn't seeing a physical location. I was experiencing it. The drone of the server intensified, not as sound, but as a vibration through my skull, resonating with something vast and ancient. My study, my monitors, the familiar clutter, all dissolved into a swirling vortex of impassable colors and shapes that had no names. I was there, or a part of me was, in that cosmic emptiness. It was a blinding, indifferent brilliance that had no source. I perceived structures, not built of atoms, but of pure, alien logic. Geometries that twisted and folded in on themselves without breaking, patterns that shifted and reformed with an agonizing slowness, yet were simultaneously instantaneous. It wasn't alive in any way I understood. There was no will, no consciousness, no malice. Just an immense, unfathomable truth. It was the underlying architecture of everything. The physics I had dedicated my life to studying, the elegant equations that described the universe, they were merely a crude, childish scribble on a cosmic napkin. This was the blueprint. A fundamental, indifferent structure that simply was. It existed beyond cause and effect, beyond time and space, beyond even the concept of existence itself. It didn't care for stars or galaxies, for life or death, for human comprehension. We were less than dust motes caught in its vast, silent operation. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp caught in my throat. My body felt like a flimsy cage, rattling apart under the sheer pressure of this perception. My mind screamed, but no sound escaped. The elegant order I had always sought in the cosmos was a lie, a comfortable delusion. The universe wasn't governed by understandable laws. It was merely a fleeting, accidental manifestation of this incomprehensible, indifferent geometry. My sanity, already frayed, stretched taut, threatening to snap with a soundless crack. My hands trembled uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of a reality that had peeled back its skin to show me its true, hideous bones. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady, propelled by an urgent, nameless need to escape the confines of my study, of my own skull. The house felt like a tomb, echoing with the silent scream of my shattered worldview. I pulled on a thick coat, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the biting winter air without a destination in mind. My car, a familiar extension of my routine, felt alien beneath my hands. I drove aimlessly, the tires crunching on packed snow, until I found myself on a deserted road leading towards the outskirts of town. I parked haphazardly and got out, drawn by the stark, desolate beauty ahead. The frozen lake shore stretched out before me, a vast expanse of white ice under a bruised, twilight sky. The wind whipped across its surface, carrying with it the scent of ice and distant pine. It mirrored the cosmic truth I had just glimpsed. The lake, frozen solid, held a terrifying stillness, a reflection of the universe's own unfeeling nature. The sky above, once a canvas of wonder, now felt like a vast, empty stare. And I, Thomas, was nothing. My life had collapsed into this. I remember a colleague, a specialist in exoplanetary atmospheres, calling me, or did he? The receiver felt cold against my ear, but the words were a jumble like static in a distant galaxy. Thomas, you sound unwell. Are you seeing this data correctly? I tried to answer, to articulate the impassable geometries blooming in the raw data, the way the cosmic background radiation seemed to breathe with an alien rhythm. But my tongue felt thick, my thoughts dissolving before they could form. Correct. It's more than correct. It's the truth beneath the truth. The voice on the other end, or what I perceived as the voice, crackled with concern. Thomas, are you alone? We're worried. You haven't been in for weeks. Weeks. It felt like a single, agonizing instant stretched across eternity. I looked around my study. The books on the shelves seemed to vibrate with a silent frequency, their spines blurring into an impossible pattern. The coffee mug on my desk shimmered, its ceramic surface rippling as if made of liquid light, briefly revealing a glimpse of something vast and indifferent beneath. It was a momentary transparency, like looking through a thin membrane at the universe's true, terrifying machinery. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The mug was solid again, but the memory of what I'd seen lingered, a persistent afterimage on my retina. Alone, I muttered, more to myself than to the forgotten receiver. No, it's here, it's always here. I couldn't recall hanging up. Perhaps I hadn't. The drone of the servers, the impassable geometries, they were my constant companions. The pattern, as I had come to call it, was no longer confined to the data. It was in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, in the repeating tessellations of the wallpaper, in the very cadence of my own breath. It was a language without words, a logic without reason, seeping into the marrow of my mind. Sometimes a brief respite would offer itself. A flash of a memory, a walk by the lake, the crisp autumn air. I clung to these fragments, these slivers of a reality I once knew, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The pattern would assert itself, twisting the memory, resculpting the familiar into something alien. One morning, or what I assumed was morning, I found myself drawn outside. The air bit at my exposed skin, sharp and invigorating. I hadn't meant to go far, but my legs carried me with an unsettling autonomy, a direct response to a silent command I didn't understand. The world around me felt thin, like a stage prop, hastily constructed. The trees, stripped bare by winter, seemed to vibrate with an inner energy, their branches tracing the same impassable geometries I now saw in the data. I walked until the familiar crunch of frozen earth beneath my boots gave way to the glassy expanse of the frozen lake shore. The wind howled across the ice, a desolate sound that mirrored the growing emptiness within me. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, the veil felt thinnest. The ice, a solid sheet of frozen water, was a canvas for the pattern. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, not random fractures but deliberate lines, forming an intricate, pulsating network that hummed with a silent, terrible energy. I knelt, pressing my gloved hand against the frigid surface. The cold was absolute, piercing, but it was also a conduit. Through the ice, through the pattern etched upon it, I felt the presence. It wasn't a being, not in any sense I understood. It was a principle, a fundamental law of existence that superseded all others, an indifferent intelligence that had merely been before the universe had bothered to form. It didn't speak with a voice, but with an overwhelming surge of understanding that wasn't mine, yet became mine. It was a flood of non-Euclidean perspectives, of dimensions folding in on themselves, of time as a meaningless construct. It wasn't fear of a monster, but of the universe itself, revealed in its raw, unfiltered indifference. The pattern on the ice began to shift, to flow, like liquid glass. It wasn't just a visual distortion, it was a conceptual one. I reached out, my fingers tracing the lines, feeling them hum beneath my touch. They promised answers, promised deeper understanding, but the cost was everything I held as real. And I was paying it gladly. The world was a lie, and the pattern was the only truth. A terrifying, beautiful truth that threatened to consume me entirely. The repeating tessellations of the dust motes. They weren't just random patterns. They were miniature echoes, fractal distortions of the greater, impassable geometry that had consumed my screens. My office, once a sanctuary of order, now felt like a petri dish where the anomaly was breeding, replicating itself in every stray thought, every wavering shadow. I didn't know how long I'd been staring at the wall, the faint hum of the servers a constant, almost liturgical drone. The world outside had become a muffled rumor, a distant, irrelevant hum. Then came the cold. I found myself pulling on my thickest coat, my scarf, my gloves, my movements automatic, detached. The drive was a blur of frosted landscapes and muted light. My car, usually an extension of my will, felt like a borrowed vessel, carrying me to an unknown destination dictated by an unseen hand. The world outside the windows shimmered, not with frost, but with a faint, almost imperceptible distortion, as if the very air was a lens warped by the pattern. I stepped out onto the frozen lake shore. The air bit at my exposed cheeks, sharp and clean, yet it carried an underlying scent I couldn't quite place ozone and something ancient, like disturbed earth. The lake was a vast, silvered mirror, stretching into the hazy distance, reflecting the pale, indifferent sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of my boots on the compacted snow. Right. It felt like the destination. In the middle distance, a small cluster of figures stood motionless. A tremor ran through me, a mix of apprehension and a strange, desperate relief. I wasn't alone. Others saw it. Others felt the pull. As I drew closer, the details emerged. They stood in a loose circle, facing the center of the lake, their backs mostly to me. No gestures, no sounds, just an unnerving stillness. One figure, taller than the others, turned slowly as I approached, holding a flicker of something that mirrored the frantic understanding swirling in my own mind. "You found your way," the woman said, her voice surprisingly soft, carrying clearly across the frozen expanse. "The pattern calls to those who are ready." My breath plumed in the frigid air. "The pattern," I echoed, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. You see it too." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "We have seen it for generations, felt its whisper in the void. It is the truth beneath the world, the logic beyond the stars." She gestured to the others who remained silent, their gazes fixed on the lake. "We are the keepers of its understanding, the seekers of its embrace." Understanding. I felt a surge of something akin to hope, quickly followed by a jolt of skepticism. My scientific mind, though fractured, still clung to the need for proof, for explanation. What understanding? This thing, it defies all known physics. It's an impossible geometry, a cosmic error, an error to those who cling to limited perception. A man, his face obscured by a deep hood, rumbled from the circle, but a revelation to those who learn to listen. The woman stepped closer, his eyes fixing on mine. "We have ancient ways, Thomas. Ways passed down through the ages, not of science, but of communion. rituals that allow us to perceive its true form, to glimpse the logic of its existence without being consumed by its indifference. Consumed by its indifference. That phrase resonated deeply within me. It perfectly articulated the terrifying, alien quality of the anomaly, the sense of being utterly insignificant before its vast, uncaring presence. My initial wariness warred with a desperate, gnawing hunger for any anchor, any explanation, any shared reality. My sanity was fraying, the edges of my world dissolving into impassable shapes. These people, whatever their beliefs, saw something similar, of resonance, of alignment. The woman replied, his gaze unwavering. We do not seek to control it, Thomas, only to understand it, to exist within its truth. And in that understanding there is a profound peace, a belonging. Belonging, the word hung in the cold air, a siren song to my isolated, unraveling mind. For weeks, I had been utterly alone with this horror, a lone explorer in an alien wilderness. Now, here were others, not just seeing it, but claiming to understand it, to have a way to navigate its terrifying depths. They didn't seem deluded, not in the way I would have once imagined. They seemed grounded in their own strange way. Their calm was unsettling yet seductive. We gather here beneath the indifferent sky, where the veil between worlds is thinnest. The woman continued, his arms sweeping out over the frozen lake. We invite Thomas, to join us, to cease the struggle and begin to truly see. My heart, which I hadn't realized was thrumming a frantic rhythm, seemed to settle, albeit into a new, peculiar beat. They offered not just understanding, but respite from the gnawing isolation. They were fellow seekers, perhaps misguided, but seekers nonetheless. And I, in my desperation, was ready to follow any path that promised to make sense of the beautiful, terrible pattern that had claimed my world. I took a step forward, towards the silent circle, towards the lure of a truth I no longer dared to question. The biting wind was an old friend by now, a constant companion that gnawed at my exposed skin. But tonight, on the vast, gleaming expanse of the frozen lake shore, it felt different. It wasn't just the cold, it was the sheer, indifferent scale of it all. Above, the sky was a canvas of impassable black, dusted with more stars than I'd ever seen from the city, each one a pinprick of frozen light, marking my previous notions of order. I pulled my heavy coat tighter, my breath pluming white and vanishing instantly. Around me the others were already gathering, dark, bundled shapes against the pale ice. There were perhaps a dozen of them, silent, their faces obscured by hoods or scarves. I could feel their collective focus, a palpable hum in the frigid air that resonated with my own deep-seated determination. This was it. Tonight, I would finally understand. The leader, a gaunt figure whose face I still couldn't quite place from our previous encounters, stepped forward, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the wind's howl. The veil thins, he intoned, his words echoing strangely across the ice. The conduit is prepared. My gaze followed his outstretched hand to a small, intricate arrangement in the center of our circle. It wasn't a sacrificial altar, not in the way I'd imagined from old stories. Instead, it was a complex lattice of polished obsidian shards, each one angled precisely, reflecting the starlight in fractured, dizzying patterns. Now, prepare to receive it. He gestured for me to kneel before the obsidian lattice. The ice was unforgiving beneath my knees, a sharp pressure through my trousers. The others began a low, guttural chant, a sound that started as individual voices but quickly merged into a single, undulating drone. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it resonated deep within my bones, a primal hum that seemed to vibrate the very air. I closed my eyes as instructed. The chanting intensified, becoming a physical force, pressing against my eardrums, vibrating through my skull. I felt disoriented, the world tilting, my sense of up and down dissolving. My scientific mind, usually so rigid, so reliant on logic, tried to find purchase, to analyze the sound waves, the frequency, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. Then came the light, even though my eyes were shut. Not a visual light, but an internal blaze, a searing white flash behind my eyelids that burned away all thought, all memory, all sense of self. It was sensory overload, a pure, unadulterated flood of something that slammed into my consciousness. I gasped. a sound lost in the relentless chanting. The chant shifted, becoming faster, more urgent, a frantic pulse that hammered against my breast. The internal light fractured into a million impassable colors, spiraling into a vortex, and suddenly I wasn't just experiencing it. I was inside it. There was no form, no shape, no discernible entity. It was the crushing weight of infinite time, the indifferent sprawl of universes blooming and dying without purpose or observer. My mind, straining, trying to find a pattern, a meaning, was met with an alien logic so vast, so utterly divorced from human comprehension, that it felt like my very neural pathways were being rewired, forcibly undone. I saw, or rather, felt, the anomaly not as data, not as a distortion, but as an inherent, fundamental property of existence. It wasn't a glitch. We were the glitch. Our reality, our physics, our tiny, intricate laws were merely a brief, localized aberration in a cosmic tapestry woven from pure, unadulterated chaos. It was the sudden understanding that order was an illusion, that consciousness was a fleeting, insignificant spark in an ocean of uncaring non-existence. My carefully constructed world, my theories, my pursuit of elegant truths, all of it crumbled into dust. The download, if that's what it was, wasn't a transfer of knowledge, but an imposition of absolute truth. It was the feeling of my own mind being stretched, thinned, until it was a transparent film, revealing the terrifying, indifferent expanse beyond. I wasn't communing with a higher power. I was being shown the utter, absolute lack of one. My scream, when it finally tore from my throat, was silent, swallowed by the roar of the incomprehensible. My body convulsed, my muscles larking, then spasming. The frozen lake shore, the chanting, the leader, all faded into irrelevance. There was only it, the vast, indifferent truth, now irrevocably burned into the deepest recesses of my being. My fate wasn't sealed by a choice, but by a revelation. There was no escaping this knowledge. There was no returning to the comfort of ignorance. The chant wasn't a language I recognized, but it burrowed into the hollow spaces of my skull, a resonant thrum that vibrated the very marrow in my bones. It swelled, an oceanic roar that felt less like sound and more like a physical force pressing down, crushing the air from my lungs. The ice beneath my knees sharpened, 1,000 tiny needles pricking through my trousers, yet I barely registered the pain. My focus was pinned to the obsidian lattice, its surface now shimmering with an impassable light, not reflected, but emanating from within, a light that seemed to unmake the darkness around it. Then it happened. Not a flash, not an explosion, but an internal implosion. The lattice didn't just glow, it opened. Not physically, but in a way that defied spatial logic, like a tear in the fabric of what I understood as perception. It wasn't information in the human sense, no words or images, but a direct, unmediated download of pure, indifferent awareness. It was the pattern, the underlying structure of everything, laid bare. It was the absolute, alien logic of a universe that didn't care, a truth so immense it atomized my very sense of self. My mind didn't break. It shattered into a million pieces, each fragment instantly reassembled, but not as Thomas. My consciousness was stretched thin, a membrane vibrating between my former self and this new, monstrous perception. The stars weren't distant suns. They were nodes in an incomprehensible network, and the space between them was not empty, but teeming with silent, unseen forces. A sudden, sharp gasp ripped from my throat. The guttural chanting around me faltered, then died down to a murmur. I was still kneeling, but my body felt distant, a vessel I was only loosely tethered to. I looked up. The faces of the others were blurred, their expressions unreadable, their forms indistinct. They were just patterns, fleeting arrangements of matter, destined to dissolve. The stranger, the one who had led me here, was watching me. His eyes, once so piercing, now seemed flat, or perhaps it was my own gaze that had changed. I tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound escaped my lips. My jaw felt stiff, unfamiliar. I pushed myself up, my limbs moving with a clumsy, almost puppet-like grace. The world tilted, not physically, but perceptually, as if a new axis had been introduced, and I was now perpetually off balance. The sky above, once a canvas of infinite mystery, was now a transparent film, revealing the intricate, terrifying geometry of what lay beyond. I saw the true nature of the light, the subtle undulations in the air that carried more than just sound. I saw the imperceptible vibrations that connected every particle of ice, every branch of the skeletal trees, every breath of the silent figures around me. They were waiting. For what, I couldn't say. Their ritual was complete, their purpose served. I was the conduit, the opening. And now I was something else. My eyes, I knew, must be different. I could feel the tension behind them, the strain of processing an infinite deluge of information that had no human context. When I blinked, the world didn't just reset. It re-rendered, displaying new layers of reality that were always there, but always hidden. I walked away from the lattice, away from the silent figures. My steps were slow, deliberate, each footfall a conscious effort to navigate this new, overwhelming clarity. The frozen lake shore stretched out, a vast expanse of white and gray, but to me, it was a tapestry of energy fields, of subatomic dances, of temporal distortions. There was no return. The Thomas who had sought answers, who had grappled with loss, was gone. He had been subsumed, overwritten. I was a vessel observing. My mind wasn't broken, it was expanded, stretched to accommodate a truth that humanity was never meant to perceive. The horror wasn't in the anomaly itself, but in its absolute indifference. It wasn't malicious, it simply was. And now, so was I. The universe was a machine, and I, Thomas, was merely a broken cog, forced to watch it turn forever.